I want you to picture a crime scene. South side of Chicago. It's the mid-70s. It's gritty. It's tense. You have this police sergeant, Richard Scanlon, lie on the ground, shot in the abdomen. And standing right there next to him is a man named James Dixon.
And, in the eyes of the law, Dixon was just done. It was what prosecutors would call a dead bang winner.
Oh, it certainly looked that way. I mean, think about the evidence stack here. You've got Dixon's fingerprints on the gun found nearby. You have a very clear motive. He was actively arguing with his girlfriend's father. Plus, you have a history of violence. And then, the absolute nail in the coffin, Dixon confessed.
Right, he actually stood in court and admitted it.
Exactly. He admitted he shot the sergeant. So, case closed. If you were on that jury, you wouldn't even need to leave the box to deliver a guilty verdict. But, and this is where the story takes a turn that honestly kind of blew my mind when I first read it a year later. An informant whispers something to a reporter. He mentions a pen gun.
Yeah, a .22 caliber pistol disguised as a fountain pen.
Which, I know, sounds like something straight out of a James Bond movie.
Oh.
But apparently the sergeant actually owned one. And he definitely wasn't supposed to.
Right, and this is the exact twist that unravels that whole dead bang case. The theory emerges that Dixon didn't shoot the sergeant at all. What happened was, the sergeant's own illegal pen gun accidentally went off in his pocket during their scuffle.
And suddenly, all that open or shut evidence we just talked about looks completely different. The powder burns. They were inside the pocket, not on the outside of the coat. The bullet trajectory was pointing downward. And Dixon, he was entirely innocent.
Which is wild. He only confessed because he thought he was being framed by the cops. He figured a confession would just get him a lighter sentence than fighting a completely losing battle.
It is a terrifying thought, isn't it? But it's also the perfect analogy for what we are tackling today, because it illustrates how our presuppositions, our lenses, determine exactly how we interpret facts. If you assume Dixon is the bad guy, the evidence points one clear way. But if you change the lens to include this pen gun, that exact same evidence proves his absolute innocence.
And the reporter who covered that specific case was Lee Strobel. At the time, he was the legal editor for the Chicago Tribune, a very hard-nosed, cynical guy, and a staunch atheist.
Right, until his wife converts to Christianity, and that completely rocks his world. So he decides to take those exact same investigative skills, the ones that uncovered the pen gun in the first place, and apply them to the biggest case in human history.
He essentially set out to disprove the faith. I mean, he wanted to rescue his wife from what he honestly thought was a cult.
But instead, he ends up writing the case for Christ, which is our source material for this deep dive today. Strobel compiled this massive file interviewing top scholars in history, archaeology, and manuscript authority.
And that is exactly what we are doing today. We're opening Strobel's files.
But we're going to do this just a little bit differently. I am going to play the role of the juror today, specifically. A very skeptical juror. It's not just going to nod along with you. I really want you to convince me. We've got the eyewitness evidence, the documentary evidence, and the corroborating evidence. The mission for you and for us is to see if there is credible proof that Jesus of Nazareth is who he claimed to be, or if this is just, a 2,000-year-old legend that got totally out of hand.
Fair enough. I accept the challenge. Let's start with the foundation. In any legal case, you have to start with the witnesses. If the biographies of Jesus, the Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if they're just fables written centuries later, the case is dismissed immediately.
Okay, so let's look at the authors then. Strobel interviews Dr. Craig Blomberg for this section. And right off the bat, I have a problem. The Gospels are technically anonymous, right? The actual text doesn't say, I, Matthew, wrote this. So how do we know these names weren't just slapped on later to give the book some kind of street cred?
That is a very valid question, but Blomberg points out that the early church testimony was remarkably uniform on this issue. There wasn't some huge debate in the 2nd century about who wrote these documents. Papias, Irenaeus, all the early heavy hitters universally ascribed them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Sure, but people lie. I mean, if I'm writing a fake religious text today, I am obviously going to claim it was written by someone super important to give it weight.
True, but that's the catch here. Are these really the important people you would choose? This is what scholars actually call the unlikely suspects theory. Think about it. If you were going to invent authors to give your totally made-up story credibility, you would choose the absolute superstars of the movement.
Right, you pick Peter. Or James. Maybe Mary.
Exactly. You definitely wouldn't pick Mark. Mark wasn't even an apostle. He was basically just Peter's secretary. And Luke. Luke was a Gentile physician. He wasn't even Jewish, and he definitely wasn't one of the original 12. They add zero authority to a fake document.
Okay, I can see that for Mark and Luke. That makes sense. But Matthew was one of the 12 disciples. So picking his name makes total sense for a forgery.
Does it, though?
Yeah.
Really think about who Matthew was in that society.
He was a tax collector.
Right. And we need to really understand what that meant in first century Judea. He wasn't just some IRS agent doing paperwork. He was considered a traitor. He was a Jewish man who was actively collaborating with the Roman occupiers to fleece his own people. Tax collectors are the most hated class of people in that entire society, ranked right down there alongside sinners and prostitutes.
I see. So if I am trying to sell a brand new religion to Jewish people, pinning my holy book on a tax collector is...
It's a marketing suicide. Complete suicide. Unless, of course, Matthew actually wrote it. The only logical reason to attach that specific hated name to that book is that he was actually the guy holding the pen.
Okay, I will give you that. It is a very counterintuitive choice. But let's talk about the timeline, because this is the biggest hurdle for me as a juror. Even if these specific guys wrote them, if they wrote them 50 or 60 or 100 years later, memories fade. Legends grow over time. It just becomes a giant game of telephone.
And that is the standard skeptical view, the idea that the Gospels were written long, long after the eyewitnesses were dead. But this is where the historical detective work gets really fun. Blomberg walks us through this logic chain involving the Book of Acts that is just incredibly compelling.
Okay, let's unpack this logic chain. Acts is the history of the early church, and it was written by Luke.
Right. Now look closely at how the Book of Acts ends. It ends very abruptly with the Apostle Paul under house arrest in Rome. It doesn't mention the outcome of his trial. It doesn't mention his death at all.
Why is that significant, though? Maybe Luke just got tired of writing or ran out of papyrus.
Think about it like a modern biography of JFK. Imagine reading this massive, detailed biography of President Kennedy, and it ends in November 1963 with him landing at the Dallas airport. And then the book just stops. What would you conclude about when that book was actually written?
Well, I'd conclude it was written before the assassination. You can't write a bio of JFK and just leave out Dallas.
Exactly. Paul was the main character of the Book of Acts. We know from secular history that Paul was executed by Nero around AD 64 or maybe late 62. For Luke to end his historical account with Paul still alive under house arrest strongly suggests he finished writing it before Paul was actually killed.
Okay, so that puts the writing of Acts at, let's say, AD 62.
And you would just work backward. Acts is a sequel. It is part 2 of Luke's work. Part 1 is the Gospel of Luke. So logically, the Gospel of Luke must be earlier than AD 62.
Okay, I'm following you.
And here is the kicker. Luke admits right in his intro that he did extensive research, and scholars universally agree that one of his main source documents was the Gospel of Mark, which means Mark has to be even earlier than Luke.
So if Acts is 62 and Luke is maybe 60, Mark is, what, mid-50s?
Exactly. We are talking about the late 50s. Jesus was executed around AD 30 or 33, so we are looking at a gap of maybe 25 or 30 years.
30 years still feels like a long time, though. I mean, honestly, I can barely remember what I had for lunch last Tuesday, let alone conversations from 30 years ago.
In terms of ancient history, though, 30 years is a blink of an eye. Let's compare it to someone else. Alexander the Great. He is one of the most universally documented figures in antiquity. Do you have any idea when his earliest surviving biographies were actually written?
I have no idea. Maybe 50 years later?
100. 400 years. The absolute best sources we have for Alexander the Great were written 4 centuries after he died. Yet modern historians consider them generally reliable. With Jesus, we have full biographies written while the actual eyewitnesses to the events were still alive and kicking.
Wow, 400 years versus 30. That definitely puts it in a different perspective. But you mentioned something earlier about going even further back, something about a creed.
Yes, this is huge. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul quotes a creed. Now, to really understand this, you have to realize that in an oral culture, before everyone had printed books or smartphones, people memorized summaries of their faith. Think of it kind of like a rhyme or a song lyric, a capsule of truth formulated specifically to lock in the facts so they could be passed on.
Okay, so it's a formalized, memorized statement.
Right. Paul writes this specific letter around AD 55, but he says, "I delivered to you what I also received." He is quoting something that already existed before he wrote the letter. This creed lists the core facts. Christ died, was buried, rose on the 3rd day, and appeared to specific named witnesses. Scholars date the actual formulation of this creed to within 2 to 5 years of the crucifixion.
2 to 5 years. That is barely enough time for the ink to dry on the Roman execution order.
It is definitely not enough time for a wild legend to completely displace historical fact. The core story was solidified immediately.
All right, Jurad is firmly back on. I hear you on the dates. but I still have a big worry about the transmission of the story. You mentioned oral culture. To a modern ear, that just sounds like the game of telephone. I whisper the sky is blue to you, you whisper it to the next guy, and 10 people later it's, this guy has the flu. How do we know the story didn't get totally twisted over those early decades?
That is probably the most common objection people have, but it assumes first-century Jewish culture was basically like a modern kindergarten class. It wasn't. It was an oral tradition, which is fundamentally different. Memorization was a highly developed, rigorous skill. It was almost a technology they possessed that we have entirely lost today.
But people are human. They still make mistakes.
True, but think about the setting. The telephone game relies on a linear whisper, one person to one person, in absolute secret. But oral tradition was communal. If a rabbi was reciting the Torah or an early Christian was telling a story about Jesus and he missed a word, the community corrected him on the spot.
Oh, so it's self-correcting.
It's a built-in check and balance system. If someone stood up in AD 55 and said, hey, Jesus fed the 5,000 with lasagna, the eyewitnesses in the crowd, and there were still hundreds of them alive, would say, no, wait a minute, we were there. It was loaves and fish. The community preserves the history, not just the frail memory of an individual.
Okay, so the telephone analogy is flawed because it ignores the fact that the original witnesses are still sitting in the room. I will grant you that. The jury is listening. But now, let's bring in the defense attorney. He stands up and says, objection. Even if the original story was true and accurate, the documents have been copied and recopied by hand for 2,000 years. The files have been corrupted.
And this naturally moves us to the documentary evidence. Strobel takes this specific issue to Dr. Bruce Metzger, who was an absolute titan in this field of textual criticism. And the core question is simple. Do we actually have what they originally wrote?
And this is where the numbers get kind of ridiculous, right? We talked about Alexander the Great earlier, but what about other ancient works? How do they stack up?
Let's take Tacitus, the famous Roman historian. We rely on him for so much of our knowledge of ancient Rome. For the first 6 books of his annals, do you know how many manuscripts we have? We have exactly 1 manuscript, and it was copied around AD 850.
So an 800-year gap between when he wrote it and the first physical copy we possess. And just 1 single copy.
Just 1. Or take Homer's Iliad. That is basically the Bible of the ancient Greeks. We have fewer than 650 manuscripts of it.
Okay, now drop the New Testament numbers on me.
We are looking at over 5,000 Greek manuscripts. And if you include early translations into Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and others, the total number jumps to roughly 24,000. There is simply no body of ancient literature in the world that enjoys such a massive wealth of textual attestation. It is an embarrassment of riches. Oh, and we even have fragments like the John Rylands Papyrus dating to around AD 100 to 150, proving the Gospel of John was already circulating far away in Egypt within a generation of the apostle.
But isn't that massive number a double-edged sword? Strobel brings this up in the source text. With 24,000 handwritten copies, there are inevitably going to be mistakes. I've heard there are something like 200,000 variants or differences between all these copies. That sounds totally devastating to the case.
It sounds incredibly scary until you actually look at what a variant is. Metzger explains that the vast majority of these are simply spelling differences or word order changes that don't even translate into English.
Explain that word order thing. Because in English, word order definitely matters. Dog bites man is a very different news story than man bites dog.
Right, but Greek is an inflected language. That means the ending of the word itself tells you what the word is doing in the sentence, whether it's the subject or the direct object. So you can write dog bites man or bites man dog or man dog bites, and in Greek, they all translate exactly the same. The dog bit the man.
Ah, I see. So the scribe gets tired, changes the word order slightly. It counts as a variant in the scary statistics, but the actual meaning is identical.
Precisely. Metzger's core assertion, and this is from a guy who spent his life studying these texts, is that no doctrine of the Christian church is in jeopardy due to textual variations. We can be about 99.5% sure of the original text.
But what about the stuff that got deliberately left out? The secret gospels. You see this on cable documentaries all the time. The idea that the early church suppressed books like the Gospel of Thomas because they contained the real but dangerous teachings of Jesus.
This is a very favorite conspiracy theory today, but Metzger completely shuts it down. The Gospel of Thomas wasn't suppressed by some smoky backroom council of power-hungry bishops. It excluded itself.
How so?
First off, the date. It was written much later, around AD 140. Second, the content itself. It's heavily pantheistic. It has Jesus saying weird things like, split the wood, I am there, lift the stone, and you will find me. It doesn't sound anything like a first-century Jew. It sounds exactly like a second-century Gnostic philosopher.
And there is that one quote you showed me from the very end of the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah.
I honestly thought it was a joke at first.
It is definitely not what you would expect to read in church. The text literally ends with Peter saying, "Let Mary go away from us, because women are not worthy of life." And the Jesus character in this text replies, "Lo, I shall lead her in order to make her a male, so that she too may become a living spirit."
Make her a male.
Yeah.
That sounds like really bad sci-fi. And it's completely discordant with the Jesus of the actual Bible, who historically treated women with incredible dignity and respect.
Exactly. The early church didn't need a massive conspiracy to reject that book. They just read it and intuitively said, this isn't the voice of the shepherd. It was essentially survival of the fittest. The authentic books naturally rose to the top.
Okay, so the jury has heard the eyewitnesses, and we've verified the documents haven't been tampered with. But let's play the ultimate devil's advocate here. Let's say we burn every single Bible in the world. We destroy every New Testament manuscript, all 24,000 of them. Is there any evidence left? Or does Jesus just disappear from history?
This brings us to the corroborating evidence. Strobel interviews Dr. Edwin Yamauchi for this part, and Yamauchi uses this fantastic, gripping analogy involving a mob hitman named Harry Elliman.
Oh, I love a good mob story. Break it down for the jury.
So Harry Elliman was this ruthless hitman operating in Chicago. The prosecutors finally had him on trial, and they had an insider witness, a guy from within the mob itself, who testified against Elliman. But the defense lawyers just tore this insider apart on the stand. They said, he's a crook, he's a liar, he's just trying to save his own skin by making up a story, and the jury was visibly wavering.
Because insider testimony is always suspect. They inherently have a bias or lens, like we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But then the prosecution brought in a secondary witness, a guy named Bobby Lowe. Now, Bobby Lowe wasn't in the mob. He was just a regular guy, completely unconnected, who happened to be walking by and saw Elliman at the scene of the crime. He had absolutely no reason to lie, no lens of bias. And his outside testimony perfectly corroborated the insider. That is what convicted Elliman.
So in the context of this deep dive, the Gospels are the insider witnesses. Who is the Bobby Lowe? Who is the outsider who steps up to the stand and confirms the story?
Secular history, and specifically two main sources. First, we have Flavius Josephus. He was a very prominent first-century Jewish historian, and it's really important to note his background. He was essentially a turncoat. He collaborated with the Romans. He certainly wasn't a Christian in any sense.
So he is a hostile witness.
Or at the very least, a totally neutral one. But in his massive history of the Jewish people, he casually mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. That specific reference is largely undisputed by modern historians.
But there's a much bigger passage in Josephus, isn't there? The Testimonium Flavianum.
Yes, there is. And we have to be completely honest here as we look at the files. Scholars firmly believe that Christian copyists messed with this specific passage centuries later. The version of the text we have today has Josephus saying things like, he was the Christ, and he appeared to them restored to life.
Yeah, a Jewish historian working for the Romans would definitely not say that. If he actually believed that, he would have just been a Christian.
Right. And this is the crucial key. When historians carefully strip away those obvious later Christian additions, the core original text remains intact. And that core text confirms that Jesus was a wise teacher, that he performed what Josephus calls surprising feats, meaning miracles, and most importantly, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate.
So even the fully stripped-down, skeptical version of Josephus confirms the main plot points of the Gospels.
Yes. And then you have Tacitus. He is the Roman historian writing about the Great Fire of Rome, which happened in AD 64. The Emperor Nero desperately needed a scapegoat for the fire, so he blamed this obscure new group called the Christians.
And what does Tacitus actually say about them in the record?
He identifies their founder as Christus. He officially confirms that this Christus suffered the extreme penalty, which is Roman phrasing for crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius.
I mean, that is basically the core of the Apostles' Creed right there, sitting in a pagan history book. Suffered under Pontius Pilate.
Exactly. And remember, Tacitus had absolutely no reason to do the Christians any favors. In that very same passage, he calls their faith a mischievous superstition. He despised them. But despite his hatred, he confirms the location, the timeline, the key political players, and the sheer fact that the movement exploded across the empire despite the shameful execution of its leader.
So let's try to land this plane and synthesize the deep dive for you, the juror. We started today with James Dixon, an innocent man who was framed by his own confession, and he was only saved because a pen gun theory completely changed how the evidence was viewed. It shifted the lens.
And Lee Strobel's central argument is that we need to look at the Jesus file with that exact same willingness to shift our lens. When you start to combine the dates of the eyewitness accounts, which we've seen are incredibly early, right on top of the actual events.
And the manuscript tradition that absolutely embarrasses every other ancient work of literature.
Right, and then you back all of that up with hostile outside corroboration from historians like Josephus and Tacitus. The cumulative weight of that evidence gets very heavy. It is not just one thing. It is the stack of facts.
And for Lee Strobel, that stack was enough to change his final verdict. He went from a cynical, atheist legal editor to a firm believer. He simply felt the evidence pointed undeniably in that direction.
And he leaves us with a really provocative closing thought. Dr. Metzger posed this brilliant question during his interview. He asked, if the historical evidence for Jesus is demonstrably stronger than the evidence for Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, and statistically, manuscript-wise, it absolutely is, then why is there still so much doubt?
Yeah, why do people accept Alexander without blinking an eye, but they hesitate so much on Jesus?
Metzger suggests that skepticism in this case often doesn't actually stem from a lack of historical facts. It stems from the implications of those facts. If Alexander the Great existed, it doesn't really change how I live my life on a random Tuesday. I don't have to change my personal morality or my worldview or my priorities.
But if Jesus is exactly who he said he was,
then it changes everything. It demands a personal response.
And that is the final question we leave with the jury today with you. Is the barrier to belief purely intellectual, based on the historical data, or is it something else? Something about the implications? That is a verdict only you can return. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
See you next time.